But with regard to the conflict between religion and science, the conflict can be very cleanly defined. The conflict is not whether or not you're going to heaven or hell, but whether or not you believe Jesus is your Savior. That's not where the conflict is. That's not what's going on in the school boards. What's going on in the school boards are people who, based on their religious text, assert that they have knowledge of the physical universe that is demonstrably false. That's where the conflict is. And I got something to say about it.
So it's less a church-state separation thing with you than just an out-and-out science education.
It's science education. If you're going to tell me that Noah had dinosaurs on his ark, I'm sorry, you are ignorant and scientifically illiterate. And you don't belong in the science classroom. And really, that's what I care about. What goes on in the science classroom? You want to teach that in Bible school? I'm not going to go knocking on your door to stop you. By the way, there is no tradition of scientists beating down the door of Sunday school, saying that might not necessarily be right. Yet you have fundamentalist religious communities trying to knock down the door of the science classroom. And that asymmetry there bothers me, because churches have been literally and figuratively a sacred place for families to go to whenever they felt the need. And by and large, the history of science has respected that. Certainly in America it has. So I'm not here to fight religious people. I'm here to clean up what's going on in the science classroom. And the moment you take your religion and put it in the science classroom and claim something that is demonstrably false, I'm going to be up in your face telling you, go learn about how the universe works.
But not because you're anti-religious, but because you're pro-science.
Because they're scientifically ignorant.
Right.
If they said, rub these crystals because you'll get healed, I'll have the same kind of argument with them. I'm not particular about the source of your false beliefs. If you come into a science classroom claiming it's science and it's not, then I've got something to say to you. Now, by the way, there's this talk about non-overlapping magisterium.
Stephen Jay Gould's notion that this truce between science and religion.
And basically, those scientists who are productive and are also religious, by and large, ascribe to that. Okay, the productive scientists who claim a personal God are not the ones saying the universe is 6,000 years old.
They say science only speaks about the natural world, and these are supernatural beliefs. Therefore, they're speaking different conversations, and they don't overlap at all.
And I'm okay with that. Okay, I don't have a problem with people feeling that way, except it's a little disingenuous, because not long ago, what it meant to be religious wasn't simply a belief in the supernatural forces. It was a belief that the contents, the literal contents of your religious text, applied to the natural world. So that religious authorities were saying, Earth is in the center of the known universe, Earth is flat, because there's no reference in the Bible, for example, to a three-dimensional thing called the Earth. All references have Earth is flat. All maps drawn of the Earth at the time were flat. That's the fact. Okay? And there was a flat circle. That is what the Earth was, with water on the edges. Venture too far. Educated people who ascribe to the non-overlapping magisterium reject the notion of a flat circular Earth, but accept other elements of the religious text. My point is that it is false to assert that religion and science do not overlap. They've overlapped forever. And every place where they did overlap, by and large, science has demonstrated something false about that prior understanding.
So religion's territory is just getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
To the point where now, what you're claiming as what is non-overlapping is yet to be touched by science, and it's the sort of the spiritual, supernatural domain. Will you go to heaven or hell? What happens to the spirit, the soul? These things that, for the moment, are pretty much outside of the reach of science. I don't claim they will forever be outside the reach of science. When they learn one day in research in neurophysiology that parts of the brain are what enable the belief in a soul, in the face of evidence to the contrary, for example. That'd be a fascinating discovery. Or not, I don't know. So they're being a little disingenuous. But the fact remains that if among scientists, a third of Western scientists, American scientists, claim a personal God, all right, well, that fraction gets a little lower when you get to those in the National Academy of Sciences. The elite scientists, that fraction is even lower, but it's not zero.
It's far lower, but it's not zero.
Well, what does far lower mean? It's a third or a half, but it's not 1/100th. It is not zero. It's, what is it, 7%? It's not 1%. It's not a tenth of a percent. It's not 100%. It's not zero. It's not any of these really tiny numbers. So I wonder, among those who are particularly adamant about ridding society of religion and its ailments that it brings.
We're talking about people like Richard Dawkins.
Yes, and Christopher Hitchens. These are people who are very vocal and visible in these sentiments. And they somehow, you would be left thinking that the public is, they just need to learn and then they'll figure out that they're deluded. You can't say that if a third of our own professional science community feels just that way. I want to see that explained first before you want to take on the general public. Some of the most highly educated scientists in the land and most highly successful scientists in the land, some of them claim a personal God. If you don't have an explanation of that for me, I don't see what right you have to run out into the street and tell the masses that those who are religious have something wrong with them. There might be something fascinating to learn about how it is that the most highly trained scientists, 1 out of 14 of them, the 7%, praise to a God to intervene in their lives. Maybe that 7% is the limit of how far you can get in convincing someone that there's no such thing as God in religion. If that's the case, let's study those people. What's going on in their brain? I want to know. These should be viewed as interesting science experiments.
These are scientific questions that are part of the social agenda of the new atheists who want to go out and change society.
And legislate or change policies. Let's find out what's going on in the minds of the 7% of the National Academy of Scientists.
Well, you'll be back on the show in 20 years and we'll survey the cognitive neuroscience revolution that they say is happening. We'll see if we can uncover the brain juice sloshing around in your noggin that explains God belief.
And by the way, quickly, I did hear your marvelous interview with Francis Collins, and I was happy to see that he agreed to the interview, and he was very candid about his views. He also had very strong views about getting things like intelligent design out of the classroom, recognizing, of course, that it is not science. Yet he, of course, as we all know, has strong personal convictions about a belief in God and that Jesus is his Savior. He once came to the American Museum of Natural History for a panel discussion. I was in the audience, and I asked him a question. And I said, suppose in a few years we learn that for those people who are religious, there's simply an area of their brain that has sort of more electrical activity than others. And that you could take someone who is not religious, stimulate that area of the brain, and all of a sudden they start believing in God and Jesus or the Quran or whatever, Buddha, whatever else. And you take away the electrical activity and it all goes away. So that we learn that religiosity and the capacity to believe in that for which there is no evidence or any strong evidence in support or in denial of it, that's all simply electrochemical activity in the brain. What would he then say to that? And I was so disappointed in his answer. It was, I don't think being religious is that simple. I think it's much more complex than that. And that we will learn that it's not that it's something
What would you have liked to ask him? I mean, what were you looking for when you asked him?
I gave him a scenario that is completely plausible that I wanted his reaction to.
That science could conceivably one day completely explain religion.
That's correct. That's correct. When people say there are things outside of the domain of science, like love, or why is it that I like this painting but not that? Science can never understand. Well, I don't know for sure, but
Shaft's a loud one.
It's plausible to me that you could take the feelings of love, analyze the neurochemical reactions going on in the brain of someone in love, map that, find someone who's not in love, stimulate all those same combinations of neurosynapses, and have that person fall in love with whatever's sitting in front of them.
Mexico.